to Super Saturday, where we kick up our training shoes and get high on incense. I'm Chief Fu Pain, and what got me into history as a kid was ancient Egypt.
As soon as my year 3 primary school teacher pulled out a picture of the pyramids and showed us a mummy, I was hooked. The whole aesthetic and idea of this ancient society was so abstract and alien, yet still so oddly familiar, I knew I had to learn as much as I could about it. And by year 7, we were still talking about Egyptian myths and culture, the mummification process and hieroglyphs, and I actually wanted to be an archaeologist, dig up an ancient tomb, explore this mysterious culture, and go on an adventure. I may have been influenced by raiders too, but regardless, I signed up for a history GCSE, ready to learn even more and really sink my teeth into all that Egypt had to offer, only to then spend 3 years learning about medical history, Germany before World War II, and castle architecture.
Well, fine. I'll do it myself. So I was initially going to go through all of ancient Egypt's military history and give you all the various developments and changes that went on throughout its entire cultural history, but...
Good God, what have we done?
Might be a bit much. So for the sake of a reasonable runtime for this video and for my own sanity, we're instead just going to go through some of the key strategies, key weapons, and a couple of battles. So let's start with martial arts. What was the most common martial art practiced in ancient Egypt?
While there exists some contention, what is the most likely theory is that an informal form of combat training and a form of boxing was practiced. Wrestling was a common sport practiced in the Sudan, which borders Egypt, so it's not unreasonable to assume that this influenced practice as well. What also serves as evidence is an account of witnessing this by Heliodorus. But what is a definite martial art in not just Egypt but in Africa is the art of stick fighting. There's variation depending upon the country and tribe. There's Maasai, Zulu, and Nuba fighting, which also has wrestling. Overall, the stick fight form most often cited as practiced in ancient Egypt is known today as Tati. Sources for Tati were known in the Absir necropolis, dated from around the Old Kingdom, originally named Fan al-Nazar wa Tativ, or the art of being straight and honest through the use of the stick.
But what use is hand-to-hand on the battlefield? Let's take a look at weapons.
The weapon of choice for any respectable field soldier was the classic spear and shield. The spear and shield, or jar and ikum, were and still are a great weapon to choose in the busy and chaotic context of a battle. Let's be honest, you have the defense of the shield with the range of the spear, but what we also need to consider is the economic and industrial layer at play here. While the ikum would commonly be wood paneled, the jar would be bronze tipped. Bronze was an easy metal to work with for weapons, but what made it more ideal was that the metal was cheap, and all that was really needed was a small tip at the spear head. So the armories and forges can make several spears quickly with only a small amount of metal, which made it more ideal. While swords were a common weapon, the sword of choice in ancient Egypt was not the standard blade. It probably existed in Egypt, especially after the conquest of Egypt that led to the Ptolemaic dynasty.
And don't worry, that hot mess will get its day.
But the sword that served as the quintessential choice was the Kapesh. First made out of bronze before transitioning to iron and primarily being seen in the New Kingdom, the Kapesh may look like a sickle that took some classes at Cobra Kai, but it actually evolved from the battle axe. Cast all in one piece, something that makes the Kapesh a mystery is that the cross-section was too thick and that the sword was too heavy to actually be used in battle, and any surviving ones being unsharpened, especially in the inside curve, where a sickle is generally sharpened. It's thought that the Kapesh was used more to trap and grip an opponent's appendages and weapons before stabbing with a sharpened tip. And even though I said about the mass of these weapons, some examples that more closely resemble daggers have also been found that would probably have been more readily used in battle. Despite the ambiguity over its usefulness, the Kapesh grew popular enough to replace the mace as the weapon of choice for higher authorities, with the first depicted pharaoh to use the Kapesh being Ramesses II.
Speaking of Ramesses, let's take a look at one of the key battles in Egypt's history, one which was early in Ramses' reign and really helped to define what sort of pharaoh he was.
The Battle of Kadesh was one of those battles which was same battle or different opponent, because Kadesh was a territory that changed hands often. Kadesh lay on one of the few points of linkage between inland Syria and the Mediterranean Sea, making it a vital territory to own for trade, sea travel, and the possibility of a launching point to invade if you were in the mood. This is where we meet the latest pharaoh, the fresh-faced, great leader that would sire many descendants, foster prosperity for his people, and be so egotistical that he would carve a temple out of a mountain, Ramesses II. One of his first military campaigns as pharaoh, Ramses had his army divided into 4 divisions, with the first being the one he would lead. The opponent for today was the Hittites, who currently held control of Kadesh, and would not let go without a fight.
Now things did seem to be on Egypt's side at first.
As an interrogation of a captured Hittite scout revealed that the Hittite forces were roughly 120 miles away, retreating after seeing the size of Egypt's forces. Ego stroking done, Ramses had his forces move onwards to their campsite outside of Kadesh, ready to march on Kadesh when the time came. But it was actually not their day, as the sending out of a scout weirded out the capture of 2 Hittite scouts, who had a surprise for Ramses. The Hittites were in the process of ambushing the campsite. Just as they were still setting up camp, 2,500 Hittites swarmed in with their own brand of chariots. Unlike Egyptian chariots that are basically mobile shooting platforms with a driver and a single archer, Hittite chariots were war machines with 2 soldiers armed with spears. It was quicker and worked at a far closer range. These chariots charged through and decimated the Ra division, and those survivors ran for camp, the Hittites at their heels. Ramses had to work quickly to galvanize his forces and hold off as many Hittites as possible. It would have been a short reign for Ozymandias if not for the arrival of reinforcements off the Phoenician coast. They were able to drive back the Hittites, but it was a hollow victory, as they had barely survived and lost a lot of men. By the time for the battle proper, both sides had been dwindled, with the Hittites losing most of their chariots in the pushback. The Egyptian army, however, became quickly overrun by the Hittite infantry, leaving Ramses with no choice except to call retreat and agree to a ceasefire with Muwatalli, the Hittite king.
Overall, a poor show for taking over Kadesh, but a win for Ramses in terms of showing his military power and being able to lead his men to survive from the jaws of death. That seems like a sturdy case for a pharaoh to build up their claim, right?
Well, then we get back to Ramesses' ego. When he got back to Egypt, you can bet he got the propaganda boys working. With poems, artwork, accounts, all of them reading, "Yeah, I totally kicked the Hittite ass. They were crying for their mommies from the start. Not even a contest."
Laborious pride aside, the Battle of Kadesh still served as a great showcase of Egyptian strategy and tactical thinking, not to mention that all of this propaganda gave Ramses more clout at a time when everyone was probably still getting used to the concept of him being pharaoh. Note to self, Ramses II video. And with that, sure, the sword, spear and shield were central in Egyptian military thinking, but what about archery? It played a role in chariot warfare, so how highly was it regarded?
To understand the importance archery played in Egyptian archery, let's first understand what sort of bow was used. The composite bow was used since the 1700s BCE, which was during the 13th dynasty before the Second Intermediate period. This bow was typically made from wood or ivory, using animal sinews as the string. So while they were around for that long, they weren't really prioritized until we reached the 18th dynasty with Amenhotep II. Amenhotep was a gifted athlete and naturally strong. While he had a knack for riding and rowing, archery became his true passion after learning from Min, the mayor of Cheni or Finis. Eventually, Amenhotep grew to the level of apparently being able to shoot an arrow clean through a copper target, while on a moving chariot. Hyperbolic maybe, but it just shows the level of infamy he had with the weapon. Archery was a regular architectural landmark from Amenhotep's reign.
And while I'd like to say that that was the most noteworthy part of the 18th dynasty, it wasn't by a wide margin. Amenhotep was a prestigious pharaoh. That's not being denied here. but his reign came after a messy succession crisis that frankly makes me squirm.
To put it basically, Thutmose III became pharaoh when he was too young to make any actual decisions, aside from when Boom Boom time was. So he had a regent in the form of his stepmother Hatshepsut, and after quietly pushing Thutmose out on the premise of probably not being right for the job, Hatshepsut became the first female pharaoh, under the clause of technically okay, but not having been done before. After a long reign of prosperity and architectural achievement, Hatshepsut passed away, leaving Thutmose to actually become pharaoh, who responded with the level-headed response of wiping Hatshepsut's name from her monuments, taking credit for her accomplishments, and making it so that no one even knew about her until centuries later.
He's an asshole.
And with that, let's finish off with a battle which was actually successful and might have made Thutmose more popular, if not for the whole damaging of history.
By 1458 BCE, having only just gotten the throne, Thutmose launched a campaign against some rebels that were fighting for land, specifically land that had been previously claimed by Egypt, but were waning control after several changes of power, the most vocal of these being the Prince of Kadesh, who had fortified himself in Megiddo, a city that had control of the Jezreel Valley, as well as sat in the primary north-south route through northern Canaan, not to mention being the easiest path through both the Jordan and the Mediterranean valleys.
Basically, Megiddo was a key point of travel, making it politically advantageous.
With this easy traversal and accessibility to greater powers an option, the best option for Egypt was to go on the offensive, and just getting to Megiddo seemed to be a problem, because by the time the army reached Yemen and had 3 possible paths to choose from, the northern and southern routes, or the Aruna Pass, a narrow and treacherous pathway that will be perfect for an ambush. Surprising everyone, Thutmose campaigned to take the pass route, which on paper sounds dangerous and, let's be honest, idiotic, but it actually worked in their favor because the Megiddo forces had anticipated them traveling on the northern or southern routes and planned to attack there.
This is either madness or brilliance.
It's remarkable how often those two traits coincide.
What happened next was truly questionable. Positioned on the Kino riverbank, Thutmose stood with his infantry, decked out in shining armor that reflected tons of light, and apparently the sight of this army and the shimmering splendor of Thutmose himself made this entire army of Megiddo forces run back to the city and leave behind all their weapons and horses.
Whether this actually happened, or if this is just a case of Thutmose III raping a history textbook, what happened next did have results.
Cutting down the surrounding orchards, the Egyptian army had a 7-foot tall wall built around Megiddo, along with a trench surrounding the city, basically playing the waiting game until they ran out of food, water, and were begging to come out, which they did. And as a result, the Egyptian economy was given a massive boost from the spoils, with mountains of gold, horses, slaves, and weapons all seized. Minimum lives were also lost, and with Egypt securing a control of the Transjordan for the next 4 centuries.
And that is where we will leave it. And with all of this being said, what are we left with?
The most obvious running theme here is probably the perversion of history.
Oh, this just hurts.
Whether the details of a battle or the wiping out of an entire ruler.
If you destroy a history book, you cheat future generations out of knowledge of the past.
Yes, this is very insightful coming from someone whose motto is, "Are you going to finish that sandwich?"
But we've seen this also in a contemporary context, making up or bending stories just for a boost of ego, or to fulfill some chase for fame that just makes you look like a clown when the truth comes out. Even so, what needs to be said is that ancient Egypt was not a culture built exclusively around the monumental pyramids and larger-than-life personas. At the end of the day, the people in charge of Egypt were still people, and made a load of mistakes, despite how hard they tried to hide it.
This is not the last time we'll be covering ancient Egypt here on this channel, and frankly, I cannot wait. Thank you for watching this week's video, and in the comments let me know what you think about ancient Egypt, and which figures and events you want to see covered. But until then everyone, peace be with you.